So thank you to SJP and to Embassy for organizing this, and thank you to all of you for coming out. Here are essentially some thoughts. When navigating through a desert, it's important to identify 3 points: where you are, where you've come from, and where you're headed. Once you have these 3 points, it's possible to lay out a trajectory, strategy, plan of action. In understanding where the Egyptian revolution is headed, we have to ask ourselves, where were Egyptians prior to the 25th of January? Where are they now? And where is it that they wish to be? We'll begin with where were they? Now, the situation on most fronts pre-25th of January was in fact pretty grim. We look at economically, the majority of the population was living in abject poverty. $1 a day, 20% of the population. $2 a day, 43% of the population. $3 a day, 2/3. The vast majority of the population is living in abject poverty. 10% of the population officially is unemployed. 25% of recent graduates, 25%. But that only tells part of the story. 42%, nearly half of employed Egyptians work in agriculture, where there is virtually no upward mobility. And more telling than unemployment is underemployment. So people who work one day but don't work the next, people who work 1 week and don't work the next, people who work 1 month and then maybe not for an entire season. This produces a significant amount of vulnerability, of insecurity. One doesn't know if one is going to be able to feed oneself and one's family the next day. So economically, the vast majority of the population is suffering. And yet, this suffering is taking place while being flanked by a significant and excessive amount of affluence and an excessive amount of luxury. If you look at Egypt, and Egypt is in fact a very wealthy country, you have 1% of the population owning 60% of assets. 1%, 60. The number of dollar billionaires that we have in Egypt will rival those that you have in adjoining Gulf states, despite the fact that the population of Egypt is significantly larger. Infrastructurally, the country is in a free fall. Since 1960, the population of Egypt has trebled and then some, from 25 million to 80 million people in some 50 years. Population of Cairo, from 3.5 to 18, a 5-fold increase. How is development meant to keep up? What do you do about water? What do you do about sewage? What do you do about education, about healthcare? How do you provide when one has increases, exponential increases in the population? And of course, you have to realize that with such growth, the population is in fact quite young. So 45% of Egyptians are under the age of 18. 60% if you bring it up to 25. A very young population indeed. Politically, a complete absence of any political or civil rights. So, false imprisonment, common. Torture, common. Assassinations, common. Disappearances, common. Estimated that some 30,000 to 40,000 political prisoners have been languishing or rotting in Egyptian jails. And the number has actually grown since the revolution. Socioeconomic rights, non-existent, sure. Healthcare, subsidized. Education, subsidized. But because of the numbers, and more importantly, because of the lack of investment, it's near impossible to keep up with population growth. Ergo, near impossible to provide them with the services they need. Why lack of investment? Well, at the behest of international institutions, Neoliberalism is in full swing in Egypt. So we have privatization, deregulation, we have a flat tax rate, 20% corporate tax, 20% maximum income tax. Right? We thought we had it bad in New Zealand with a maximum of 34. Imagine there a maximum of 20. But we can rest assured we have something in common with the Egyptians. No capital gains tax here, no capital gains tax there. So moving right along. Where are we today? Where are Egyptians today? Now the situation was pretty dire, and then the sun rose on the 25th of January, and the situation has since shifted. We have to understand that on the 25th of January was the launch of the greatest mass movement that Egypt has known in its contemporary history. Now it's hard to say exactly what sparked it. Was it the Tunisian Revolution? Possibly. Was it mass poverty? Maybe. Was it youthful anger? Young people, as we said, 60% under the age of 25. Was their anger what triggered, what sparked this revolution? I'll be part of it. Combination of all of the above, most likely. I liken it, if you will, to a prairie fire. If we think of a prairie fire, we try to make sense of it after the fact. But when it's happening, all we can really do is stand there and marvel at the beauty of it as the fire spreads and consumes everything. Unless, of course, you're running for cover, in which case you're not marveling at anything. Now, Mubarak was running for cover. And Mubarak was shielded, at first, by his entourage. He was shielded by the army. He was shielded by his American patrons. How did Hillary Clinton refer to him? As family? I kind of think of this poor woman at Christmas dinner, flanked on one hand by Bill and Hosni by the other, and thinking to herself, dear God, where did I go wrong? But eventually the American patrons turned, the army turned, and his entourage was scattered. And Mubarak found himself all alone with his sons, sitting in Sharm el-Sheikh. Mubarak's sacrifice was necessary. It was necessary. But Mubarak's sacrifice didn't, in fact, address any of the concerns that brought tens of thousands of Egyptians, that brought hundreds of thousands of Egyptians, that brought millions of Egyptians onto the streets of Egypt. So the revolution persisted, for the demands still had not been met. Poverty, unemployment, illiteracy, insecurity, inequality, despair, all of these were still present despite Mubarak's departure. So as I said, Mubarak's sacrifice, his scapegoating, if you will, was necessary, but did not address any of the concerns. It was, however, enough to give, his sacrifice was enough to give the army opportunity to organize a counter-revolution. And this is where we find ourselves now, in the midst of a counter-revolution. We'll ask ourselves, what is a revolution? A revolution is a transformation. What is a counter-revolution? Counter-revolution is status quo. How to preserve the status quo? By knocking the wind out of the revolutionary movement. How has this military council gone about doing that? One of the things. Establish new procedures for the creation of new political parties. New procedures. Very Byzantine in their approach. And so what do we have right now? 148 applications for new political parties. 148. Can you imagine the disunity in the political landscape once the dust settles and we have a couple of hundred political parties to deal with, battling it out at the polls? Military tribunals are in full swing. We're having trials, 30-minute trials, activists, revolutionaries, people who were in Tahrir Square. Why? Because they were engaged in disturbing the peace. And disturbing the peace carries a 5 to 10 year sentence, hard labor. A couple of hundred activists are already have already been convicted. Counter-revolution, cutting off the revolutionary movement at its knees. Discussions are underway with the IMF, that bastion of progressiveness. Some have failed and others are being worked out. Religious strife, sectarianism is on the rise. While I was in Egypt, a Christian woman was allegedly trying to convert to Islam. She was prevented from doing so by a number of cops, and she was shackled in a church. And then some thugs arrived and broke the doors down, and the Mexican soap opera went on, and a number of people, over a dozen, lost their lives. Distraction after distraction, provocation after provocation. This is how one preserves the status quo.